I was standing my post at the east portico of the palace at Harrowgate, in the grey hush just after sunrise when the dew is still thick on the lawns, and the household has not yet properly woken, when I saw Princess Maelin come running across the grass toward me barefoot, in her nightgown, sobbing so hard she could barely get the words out. "They locked me out," she said, when she was close enough to throw both arms around my waist and bury her face against my tunic. All night, it felt like all night, nobody came. And then she was crying too hard to say anything else at all, and I was on my knees on the wet grass with a 9-year-old princess shaking in my arms before I had any idea in the world what she was talking about. I want to tell you plainly, at the very start of this, the way I have learned to tell it every time since, because the story has a way of running ahead of itself if you let it. Nothing had happened to Princess Maelin that night that deserved the fear she was carrying across that lawn. I did not know that yet, in the moment I am describing. I want to be honest about that too. For the length of time it took me to get her calm enough to speak in whole sentences, I did not know what I was dealing with, and a man in my position, hearing a child use the words "locked me out" and "all night" in the same breath, does not get to assume the best. You assume the worst, you move fast, and you sort out the truth of it afterward. That is the job. But I promised myself, telling this story to the young guardsmen I trained in the years after, that I would always say clearly, as early as I could, what the truth of that morning turned out to be, because it does no one any good, least of all Maelin, wherever she is now, a grown woman probably tired of hearing this story told about her, to let people sit for half the telling believing something far darker than what actually happened. My name is Emeric Voss. I served in the guard at Harrowgate for the better part of 20 years, the last 11 of them with a standing assignment near the royal children's household, and in all that time, I never had a morning quite like the one I am about to tell you about. Not because it was the most dangerous or the most dramatic thing I ever handled, but because it taught me something about the particular weight a frightened child's words can carry, and how much care it takes to get underneath them to what is actually true. I had come to that household posting somewhat later than most guardsmen who end up in it, having spent my first 9 years in the more conventional postings. The state gates, the formal processions, the long stretches of standing perfectly still through ceremonies that asked nothing of a man but his composure. I was good enough at that work, though I never took the particular pride in it that some of my fellow guardsmen did. What drew me, eventually, to request a transfer to the children's household was less any romantic notion of protecting the young and more a plain, practical observation I had made over those first 9 years, standing at enough state functions to watch enough parents and enough children pass through them, that the people who most needed a careful, attentive guard nearby were very rarely the powerful men and women those state functions were arranged around, and very often the smallest, quietest people in the room, the ones nobody thought to watch closely because nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen to them, right up until the one day something did. I do not say that to suggest I arrived at Harrowgate's nursery wing, expecting anything like what happened that particular morning. In 11 years of that posting, the overwhelming majority of my duties were exactly as unremarkable as anyone might hope a children's household to be: skinned knees, misplaced toys, the occasional nightmare that wanted a calm adult voice in the corridor outside a bedroom door until it passed. I want to say that plainly, because I think it matters to understanding why the morning with Maelin affected me as deeply as it did. It was not one incident among many similar ones. It was, in 11 years of otherwise ordinary service, close to the only time a child in that household used words as frightening as the ones she used to me on that lawn, and I have come to believe, turning it over many times since, that it was precisely because such moments were so rare in that particular household that I felt the full weight of it so completely when one finally came. I should say something too about the particular character of that household in the years I served it, because I think a listener coming to this story without knowing it might reasonably wonder, hearing a child cry, "They locked me out all night," whether such a thing could be even remotely plausible in a family like the one at Harrowgate. It could not, and I want to be as plain about that as I know how to be, before I go any further into the account itself. Crown Prince Rowan and Princess Alara were, in every particular I observed across 11 years, standing close enough to their household to see the truth of it rather than merely the public performance of it. Attentive parents who checked on their children more often than duty strictly required, who knew each child's particular fears and comforts by heart, and who treated even minor upsets, a bad dream, a quarrel between siblings, a scraped knee, with a seriousness that never once struck me as performed for anyone's benefit. I mention this not to excuse anything that happened the evening before the morning I am describing, because nothing about a genuinely loving household prevents an old Latch from failing at exactly the wrong moment, but because I think it matters enormously to how the rest of this story should be understood. What Maelin lived through was real, and frightening, and worth every bit of the careful attention I gave it that morning. But it did not happen because anyone in that household had stopped watching her. It happened because a piece of old ironwork failed silently, the way such things sometimes do, in the one narrow window where even the most attentive household cannot watch every door at once. She was cold. That was the first thing I registered once I had my arms properly around her, and could take stock of her the way training taught me to, quickly and without letting my own alarm show on my face. Her feet were bare and pink with the wet grass, her nightgown was damp at the hem, and she was shivering, though I could not yet tell whether that was the early morning chill or something closer to shock. I got my own coat off and around her shoulders inside of 5 seconds, which is a thing you learn to do without thinking after enough years of standing post near small children who have a habit of finding trouble at inconvenient hours, and I said her name, twice, low and steady, the way you talk to any frightened creature you want to bring back down out of a panic. "Maelin, Maelin, look at me. You're safe, I've got you." She did not stop crying immediately. I would have been surprised if she had, but the sobbing changed character, the way it does when a child moves from crying because they are alone with something frightening to crying because someone has finally arrived to share the weight of it with them. She burrowed further into my coat and got out in broken pieces between breaths the same handful of words she had started with. "Locked out. All night. Nobody came." "Forever," she said at one point, or something close enough to it. It felt like forever, and I felt my whole chest go tight and cold in a way that had nothing to do with the morning air, because those are not words a guard at Harrowgate is meant to hear about any child in that household, let alone the king's own granddaughter, without every instinct in him going straight to the worst possible explanation. I did not ask her anything yet. I have learned, over enough years around frightened children, that the very first thing you owe them is not information. It is safety, plainly demonstrated, before you ask them to relive whatever put them in this state in order to satisfy your own need to understand it. So I picked her up. She was light enough still, at 9, though she would not thank me for saying so now, and I carried her in through the portico and down toward the small guardroom nearest the kitchens, where there was a fire already lit for the early kitchen staff and a bench where I could sit her close to the warmth and get a blanket properly around her rather than my coat, which smelled of brass polish and was doing her damp feet no favors. It was perhaps 90 seconds of walking, no more, and in that 90 seconds I ran through, with the particular cold clarity that comes over you in a genuine emergency, everything I would need to do next. Find out where she had actually been. Find out who else knew. Find out, and this was the thought that frightened me most, if I am honest, whether anyone in that household had known and had done nothing, because a child does not arrive at locked out all night over a small thing, not usually, and a guard who has spent 11 years near that particular household does not get to assume that not usually covers every case. I got her settled on the bench by the fire, wrapped the blanket properly around her bare feet, and crouched down in front of her so that my eyes were level with hers, rather than looming over her the way a grown man does without meaning to. I have found over the years that this single adjustment, getting down to a child's own height rather than staying tall above them, does more to steady a frightened child than almost anything you can say to them. "You're safe now," I told her again, because it bears repeating more than once to a child in her state, and repetition costs nothing. "You're inside, you're warm, and I am not going anywhere. Can you tell me what happened? Take your time. I promise you I'm listening, and I promise you nothing you tell me is going to make me angry with you." That last part mattered more than I understood in the moment I said it, because it turned out later that some part of her fear that morning was not only about the door. It was about whether she was going to be in trouble for having gone out to the garden alone in the first place, and for going back out to it again at first light without telling anyone. Children carry that particular fear alongside whatever else has frightened them, and a guard who does not think to address it directly sometimes finds a child holding back the very details that matter most, simply because she is afraid of what will happen to her for admitting them. She told it to me in the disordered, non-linear way that children in genuine distress tell things, circling back, repeating herself, losing the thread and finding it again. And I want to set down here roughly what she said, in roughly the order she said it, before I tell you what I later established had actually happened, because the gap between the two is the whole of this story. She told me that last night. She meant the evening before, though at 9, in the grip of real fear, the exact word for when something happened is often the first casualty. She had gone out to the walled garden after supper to play with Juniper, the half-wild tabby cat who lived mostly among the cold frames in the gardener's shed, and whom Maelin had adopted, in the particular fierce way children adopt animals that do not entirely belong to them, as her own special friend. She told me the cat had run off through the larkspur door, the old side gate in the garden wall that led out past the glass houses toward the kitchen yard, and that she had chased after it without thinking, the way children chase things, and that the door had swung shut behind her, and that she had not been able to get it open again no matter how hard she pushed and pulled and pounded on it. "I called and called," she told me, her voice cracking on the word called, "and nobody came, and it got dark, and I thought," and here she stopped and pressed her face into the blanket, "and I let her have the silence rather than filling it, because some sentences a child needs to be allowed not to finish. And then this morning," she went on when she had gathered herself, "I went to look at the door again because I couldn't sleep, and it's still broken, Emeric. It's still exactly the same, and I got so scared because what if it happens again? What if next time nobody ever comes at all?" I want to stop the account there, at exactly that point, and tell you plainly what I did not yet know but would establish within the hour, because I promised at the start of this that I would not let this story run ahead of the truth the way it ran ahead of poor Maelin's own 9-year-old understanding of it that morning. What had actually happened to her the evening before was this. She had indeed chased Juniper through the larkspur door at dusk, and the door had indeed swung shut and caught behind her, held fast by an old spring latch that had, through some fault in its recent repainting, begun engaging more firmly than it should, and refusing to release from a small girl's grip no matter how she worked it. She had indeed been frightened, alone in a walled garden as the light failed, calling for help that did not come as quickly as she wanted it to. All of that was true, and none of it is a small thing to have happened to a child of 9, and I do not want to suggest otherwise at any point in this telling. But she had not been out there anything close to all night. She had not been abandoned or forgotten or left to fend for herself while a household went on about its evening unconcerned. The whole of her time alone behind that door, from the moment it caught to the moment the palace's head gardener, an old, unhurried, deeply kind man named Cormac Hollies, found her sitting against the garden wall and swept her straight up into his arms, was, as I would establish with a precision that surprised even me by the end of that morning, 19 minutes, not all night. Not hours. 19 minutes at dusk, on an evening when her mother and father knew within the half hour that it had happened at all, and when the whole household had spent the rest of that night mortified that it had happened even that briefly. I did not know any of that yet, kneeling in front of her on that bench by the kitchen fire. All I knew was a 9-year-old girl telling me, through real tears, that she had been locked outside all night and that nobody had come. And a guard hearing those words has exactly 2 responsibilities in the moment he hears them, and I set about both of them at once. The first is to comfort the child in front of him without delay or reservation. The second is to find out, as fast and as thoroughly as it is possible to find out, whether what she is describing is what actually happened. Because if it is, then something has gone gravely wrong in a household I had spent 11 years trusting to care properly for its children. And if it is not, then a frightened child is carrying a weight this morning that the truth, gently and clearly established, can lift from her. I did not for one second, sitting there, assume it would turn out to be nothing. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters to how carefully I went about what came next. A guard who assumes the best before he has checked does his post no credit at all. I assumed nothing. I simply began, as calmly as I could manage with my own heart still hammering from the sight of her running across that lawn, to find out. "Maelin," I said, when she had cried herself down to something closer to steady breathing, "I am going to find out exactly what happened last night. Every bit of it. I promise you that. But I need you to stay right here where it's warm with someone looking after you while I go and ask some questions. Can you do that for me?" She nodded against the blanket, and I looked up and caught the eye of one of the kitchen maids who had come in to bank the fire higher, and had gone very still and wide-eyed at the sight of a barefoot, weeping princess wrapped in a guard's coat on the bench by her ovens. I asked her quietly to sit with the princess, to get her something warm to drink, and to send word at once. At once, I said again, so there could be no mistaking the urgency, to the nursery wing that Princess Maelin had been found safe with me and was being cared for, and to crown Prince Rowan and Princess Alara directly, wherever they could be found in the palace at that hour. I want to say something here about what happened in the roughly 4 minutes between that message going out and Princess Alara arriving at the guardroom door, because it tells you something important about how this household actually treated the report of a frightened child, as opposed to how the story might sound if you only heard Maelin's own broken account of it from that first morning. Alara did not walk. She did not send someone ahead to inquire first and follow at a dignified pace once matters were confirmed. She came at something close to a run, her hair not yet properly done for the day, and she was through the guardroom door and on her knees in front of her daughter before I had finished explaining to the kitchen maid where the extra blankets were kept. "Maelin, Maelin, sweetheart, I'm here." Alara had her daughter's face in both hands within seconds, searching it the way a mother does, checking without needing to ask that nothing new and worse had happened since the evening before. "What's wrong? What happened? Why are you outside without your—" And then she saw the bare feet, damp and pink from the grass, and something in her expression tightened in a way I understood completely, because I had felt the same cold drop in my own stomach not 5 minutes earlier. "She went back out to look at the garden door this morning," I told her quietly, keeping my voice level so as not to alarm Maelin further. "It seems she's still very frightened about what happened last night. I don't have the full account yet, Your Highness. I only have what she's told me so far, which is that she felt locked out for a very long time and that nobody came. I intend to establish exactly what did happen, as precisely as I can, this morning." Alara looked at me for a long moment, and I watched something complicated move across her face. Relief, mixed with a fresh wave of guilt, mixed with the particular helplessness of a parent realizing that a matter she believed had already been resolved the night before was, in her daughter's heart at least, very much not resolved at all. "She was found within 20 minutes, Alara said to me, low, meant for my ears more than for Maelin's, though Maelin was listening to every word, I could tell, even with her face still half hidden against the blanket. "Rowan and I were with her by 7:30. We sat with her ourselves until she fell asleep. I promise you, Sergeant, nothing like what she's describing happened to her last night. I believe you, Your Highness, I said, and I meant it. Alara was not a woman inclined to soften an unpleasant truth for my benefit, and the specificity of what she had just told me, 20 minutes, 7:30, we sat with her ourselves, was not the kind of detail an anxious parent invents to cover for genuine neglect. But I want to be honest about something else too, because it is part of what makes this story worth telling rather than simply a case of a mother reassuring a guard and the matter ending there. Believing a report and confirming it are two different disciplines, and my 11 years near that household had taught me never to let the first stand in for the second, however much I trusted the person giving it to me. A household can believe, in good faith, that a matter has been fully resolved and still be missing a piece of it. I did not think Alara was lying to me. I thought it entirely possible that she did not yet have the whole picture herself, and that the gap between what she believed had happened and what Maelin was still living through, hours later in her own 9-year-old heart, was exactly the gap I needed to close. "I'd like your permission to look into it properly," I said. "Speak to the staff who were involved, check the household log for the times, understand exactly how the door came to fail, and whether it's been put right since. Not because I doubt what you've told me, Your Highness, because Maelin needs to hear it laid out clearly, from someone who checked every piece of it himself, before she'll believe it in the part of her that's still frightened. And because if that door isn't fully mended, I want to know it before she goes anywhere near that garden again." Alara's eyes went to her daughter, and something in her face settled, the particular relief of a parent handing a problem to someone she trusts to actually solve it rather than simply manage. "Do whatever you need to do, Sergeant. I want this finished properly, not smoothed over." Finished. That word, finished, is the one I held onto through everything that followed that morning, because it turned out, as I will tell you, that what had happened to Maelin the evening before really had been a small, brief, entirely accidental thing, resolved within the hour by people who loved her and were mortified it had happened at all. But finished, as I would discover before the morning was half over, was not quite the right word yet for the door itself, and it was in the gap between those two things, a fright that was genuinely small and already over, and a repair that was not yet as complete as everyone believed it to be, that the real work of that day turned out to lie. I left Maelin with her mother and the kitchen maid, both of them now fussing over her with warm milk and dry stockings, and I went to find out, piece by piece, exactly what had happened in that garden the evening before, and exactly why a 9-year-old girl was still, the following morning, running barefoot across a wet lawn, convinced that she had been abandoned all night by people who, in truth, had never stopped looking for her for longer than it takes to walk the length of a garden wall. My first stop was the nursery wing, where I found Susan Locke, the nursery maid who had charge of the children's evening routine, still visibly shaken from the night before and grateful, I think, for the chance to tell someone the whole of it properly rather than have it summarized second-hand. "I take full responsibility for not noticing sooner," she told me straight away, before I had even asked her a proper question, which told me something about the state she had been carrying since the evening before. I had Prince Bram in the bath and Prince Torin was meant to be minding the time for his sister's turn, and between the two of them I lost track of exactly when Princess Maelin went out. I thought she was still in the schoolroom finishing her reading. "Walk me through it from the start," I said. "Supper first. What time did that finish?" 6:30 near enough, Susan said. "The children have their supper early, you'll know that, Sergeant." They were finished and excused by 6:20, and it's their usual habit on a fine evening to have a little time in the walled garden before baths, so long as one of us can see them from the nursery windows or the back terrace. It's not unsupervised exactly, only, the garden's meant to be safe. It's walled. There's nowhere for them to come to harm in it, or so we always believed. "And Maelin went out into the garden at what time?" Susan thought about it, her brow furrowed with the particular effort of a person trying to reconstruct exact minutes from a memory that had, until that point, not seemed worth measuring so precisely. 7:15, I'd say. Perhaps a few minutes either side of that. I saw her go from the schoolroom window with the cat already running ahead of her toward the glass houses, and I remember thinking she'd want calling in within the half hour for her bath, and going back to Prince Bram, because he does splash something dreadful if you leave him a moment too long unwatched. When did you realize she wasn't where you expected her to be? Not until I went to fetch her for her bath, Susan said, and here her voice caught a little. That would have been close to 20 to 8. I looked in the schoolroom, thinking she'd come back in from the garden on her own the way she usually does, and she wasn't there, and I went out onto the terrace calling for her, and that's when Cormac came round the side of the glass house with her already up in his arms, telling me she'd been shut in behind the larkspur door and he'd only just found her himself. I want to pause here and set down, as plainly as I can, what that account establishes, because it is the heart of everything I am telling you. Maelin went into the garden at roughly 7:15. She was discovered missing from where she was expected by roughly 20 to 8, 25 minutes later, though that is the outer bound of the time she could conceivably have been shut behind that door, not the actual length of it, since Susan did not yet know at 20 to 8 that anything had gone wrong at all, only that Maelin was not where she was supposed to be, and Cormac had already found her by the time Susan came looking. The true window, the actual span of minutes in which Maelin was alone, frightened, behind a door that would not open, was shorter still, and I would establish its precise length within the hour, from a source neither Susan nor I had thought of yet. Cormac's own watering log, which he kept, out of the same unhurried habit that made him such a fine gardener, with the particular exactness of a man who liked his records straight. What happened once Cormac had her? I asked. He carried her straight in, Susan said. She was crying, properly crying, frightened the way any child would be, but he told me straight away she wasn't hurt, not a scratch on her, only frightened and a bit chilled from standing in the evening air. I had her wrapped and dry within a few minutes, and I sent word to the Crown Prince and Princess Alara at once. I didn't wait, Sergeant. I want you to know that. I sent a message the very moment I understood what had happened, before I'd even got her properly settled. And they came. Within minutes. I've never seen the princess move so fast through that corridor in all my years in this household. She had Maelin in her arms and was asking her every question you could think to ask. Was she hurt? Was she cold? Was she frightened? Did anyone frighten her on purpose? And Maelin was already calming by then, already telling her mother the cat had run off and the door had stuck, in her own words, the way a resilient child does once the immediate fright has passed and a parent's arms are around her. By 8:30 she was bathed and warm and in her own bed with her mother sitting beside her. I stayed in the nursery corridor myself another hour after that, in case she woke distressed, but she slept the whole night through, Sergeant. I checked on her twice myself. She slept. I believed every word of that account, and I want to say plainly that nothing in it describes anything resembling the all-night Maelin had sobbed to me on the lawn that morning. A child missing from where she was expected for perhaps 25 minutes at the outside. A discovery, a rescue, a mother's arms within minutes of the alarm being raised. A bath, a bedtime story, a full night's sleep with staff checking on her twice more before dawn. That is not neglect. That is not abandonment. That is a household that responded, by any fair measure, about as quickly and as thoroughly as a household possibly could to a frightened child's cry for help. But it is also, I want to be equally plain, not nothing. 20 minutes alone behind a door that will not open, as the light fails at 9 years old, is a genuinely frightening experience, and nothing in what I am telling you should suggest that Maelin's fear that evening was invented or overblown in the moment she was living it. The exaggeration came later, in the retelling, in the reliving, in the particular way a child's sense of time stretches when she is frightened and alone, so that 20 minutes becomes, in memory, something closer to forever, and forever by the next morning becomes the words all night, spoken with complete sincerity by a girl who was not lying to me on that lawn. She was telling me, as best her 9-year-old understanding could manage, exactly how it had felt. That distinction between what had actually happened and how it had felt to a frightened child living through it was the whole of what I needed to untangle that morning, for Maelin's sake as much as anyone's. But before I could go to her with the full account, laid out clearly enough that even her frightened heart could hold on to it, I needed the 2 pieces Susan Locke could not give me. Cormac's own precise account of the minutes he had spent finding her, and the state of that door itself, because Maelin's freshest fear, the one that had sent her running barefoot across the lawn that very morning, was not about the night before at all. It was about whether the door was still broken, whether it could happen again, whether next time anyone would come at all. And that was a question I intended to answer with my own 2 eyes before the morning was out. I found Cormac Hollies exactly where the kitchen boy told me I would, already at work among the cold frames on the far side of the walled garden, though it was not yet 7 in the morning, and no one would have blamed him for taking a slower start after the night he'd had. He was a broad, unhurried man well past 60, with the kind of permanently weathered face that comes from 40 years spent outdoors in every kind of Eldermore weather. And when he saw me coming across the gravel path toward him, he straightened up from his work with an expression that told me, before I had said a single word, that he had been waiting for someone to come and ask him about the evening before, and had not been looking forward to it. "You'll be here about the princess," he said before I could open my mouth. "I heard she was out on the lawn this morning, crying fit to break your heart. Is she all right? Truly all right, I mean, not the kind of all right people say to be polite." "She's warm and with her mother," I told him. "But she's very frightened still, Mr. Hollies, more frightened this morning than anyone expected her to be after last night, and I'm trying to understand exactly what happened so I can put that fear to rest properly, rather than just tell her it's fine and hope she believes me. Can you walk me through it? From the beginning, if you're able, every detail you remember." He nodded slowly, set down his trowel, and wiped his hands on the rag that hung from his belt, the unhurried gesture of a man giving himself a moment to gather a memory he did not particularly want to revisit, but understood the importance of getting right. "I was doing my last round of the glass houses," he said. "I always do it just before I finish for the day, checking the vents are shut and the watering's done for the tender things that don't like the night air. I keep a little book for it, mind, not because anyone asked me to, only because I'm an old man now and my memory for what I've watered and what I haven't isn't what it was, so I note the time I start and the time I finish each section, out of habit more than anything." He reached into his coat and produced a small, worn notebook, its pages soft at the corners from handling, and opened it to the previous evening's entry without needing to search for it. "Here. Started my round at 7:15. That's my habit near enough every evening, rain or shine. I was through the first glass house and starting on the second when I heard something, not a scream, mind, nothing so loud as that, more a kind of calling, thin and a bit desperate, coming from over by the larkspur door. Took me a moment to place it, because sound carries strange in that corner of the garden with the wall so high, but once I placed it I didn't waste any time. I was there inside a minute, I'd say, maybe less." "And what did you find?" "The princess sat right down against the wall with her knees pulled up, and that cat of hers pressed up against her side like he knew something was wrong and wasn't going anywhere. She wasn't screaming by the time I got to her. She told me after she'd worn herself out calling and had settled to just waiting, which I think, if I'm honest with you, Sergeant, is the part that near broke my heart when I heard it. A child of 9, deciding on her own that no one was coming and she'd best just wait quiet. But she wasn't hurt. Not a mark on her, not a scrape, nothing but cold hands and a frightened face, and I had her up in my arms before she'd even finished telling me the door wouldn't open. I didn't so much as try the latch myself first. I judged getting her out of the cold and into someone's care mattered a good deal more than understanding why the door had failed. And I still believe that was the right order to do things in, whatever else might be said about the evening. "What time was that when you found her?" Cormac turned the little notebook toward me and pointed at a line written in a careful, old-fashioned hand. "Finished the first glass house at 7:30 exact. I always note it, like I said. Started the second straight away, which is when I heard her, so it can't have been more than a minute or two past the half hour. I had her inside and into Susan Locke's arms, by my own reckoning, no later than 7:20. So however long she was behind that door, and I never did get her precise on when she went out, being that upset. It wasn't above 25 minutes at the very outside, and I'd wager, knowing how quick that cat of hers runs off the moment supper's cleared, it was closer to 20. I want to set down here, because it matters to everything I am telling you, that I would later confirm this account against 3 separate sources. Susan Locke's own recollection of when she saw Maelin leave the schoolroom window, the porter's log at the kitchen yard gate, which recorded Cormac himself passing through with the princess in his arms at 17 minutes to 8, and strangest and most useful of all, a note in the kitchen's own supper log showing the exact minute the children's plates had been cleared that evening, 22 minutes past 6, which let me work backward with real confidence to the moment Maelin would have finished her own meal and been free to go out and play. Every source agreed, within a minute or two of each other on the same span. Maelin went into the garden a little after 7:15, was shut behind that door for somewhere between 19 and 25 minutes, and was in a trusted adult's arms, safe and being carried indoors, before 8 o'clock had struck. 19 minutes was the figure I settled on in the end, cross-checking Cormac's watering log against his own known unhurried pace between glass houses, which he was able to demonstrate for me later that same morning by simply walking it, notebook in hand, while I timed him. 19 minutes, not all night, not even, properly speaking, after dark. The light was failing, as it does in Eldermore in that season, by 7:30, but full dark had not yet fallen when Cormac carried her indoors, and every account agreed she had never once been in true blackness, only in the deep blue dimness of a summer evening winding down. "Why didn't the door open?" I asked him. "Talk me through that part." Cormac's face darkened in a different way then, less grief and more a kind of professional shame, the particular discomfort of a craftsman describing a failure in something under his care. "That latch has been on my list for near 2 months now, Sergeant, and I'll not pretend otherwise to you or to anyone. It's an old spring mechanism, older than I am in that housing if not in its parts, and it had a fresh coat of paint put on the ironwork back in the spring, which I asked for myself, mind, because the old paint was flaking something dreadful, and I didn't like the look of it against the new trellis work. But paint gets into places it oughtn't, even careful paint, and I believe, though I'll let the locksmith confirm it properly, that a bead of it worked down into the spring housing and stiffened the action just enough that the latch has been engaging harder than it used to, catching firm the moment the door swings shut, where before it always wanted a good firm push to properly seat. A grown man's hand, or an old hand like mine that knows its particular stubbornness, can still work it open from the inside with the right amount of force applied the right way. A child's hand, especially a frightened child pulling straight instead of working the small lever the way it wants, cannot. I'd flagged it to the steward back in the spring as wanting attention, and again a fortnight passed when I noticed it sticking worse than before, and I'll own that I did not flag it with the urgency it plainly deserved, because in 40 years no child has ever once gone through that door alone, and I did not think to imagine one would. "Has it been fixed since last night?" Here Cormac hesitated, and it was that hesitation, more than anything he actually said next, that told me the morning's real work was not yet finished. "Master Corliss came out himself last night, once the household had settled, and looked at it with me," he said. He agreed it wanted replacing entirely, not just freeing up, a proper modern latch, one that releases easy from the inside with no particular trick to it, the kind fitted on the nursery doors already. He said he'd have Mr. Hale, our locksmith, out to fit one directly. And has he? Not yet, Cormac admitted. Mr. Hale does his rounds of the household on a fixed schedule, Sergeant, Tuesdays and Fridays mostly, unless it's urgent enough to call him out special, which costs the household a good deal more and Master Corliss doesn't like to do without good reason. Last night was a Wednesday. I understood the message to mean he'd be sent for on Friday's round, 2 days off yet, and in the meantime I wedged the latch with a folded bit of leather so it can't fully seat and catch the way it did last night. It'll open from the inside now with a firm push. I tested it myself before I came out to the frames this morning. But it's a stopgap, not a mend. And I'll tell you honestly, it was that very door the princess went out to look at again this morning, before you found her on the lawn. I saw her from the glass house, standing in front of it in her nightgown at first light, and I called out to her that it was safe now, that I'd fixed it so it would open. But I don't know that she heard me properly, or believed me if she did. She was already crying by the time I got close enough to say it a second time, and she ran off toward the portico before I could reach her. I stood there in the cool morning air for a moment, turning that over, because it was the piece that changed the shape of the whole morning for me. Everything Cormac and Susan and Alara had told me painted an evening that had gone, by any reasonable measure, about as well as a frightening accident could go, quick discovery, quick comfort, a family that responded within minutes and never once treated the matter as anything less than serious. That much I could take to Maelin, and to her parents with complete confidence. But the door itself was not yet properly mended, only propped, and a 9-year-old girl who had lain awake half the night reliving 19 frightening minutes had gone out at first light to check on the one thing that would tell her whether it could happen again, and had found a leather wedge and a promised 2 days off, rather than the plain, solid certainty a child that age actually needs. I did not think anyone in that household had been careless, exactly. I thought a genuinely small, well-handled accident had been followed by a genuinely reasonable, entirely ordinary piece of household scheduling, Tuesdays and Fridays, unless urgent, that nobody had quite recognized, in the relief of the evening before, as still urgent enough to override. And I thought that gap, small as it was on paper, was precisely the thing standing between Maelin and actually believing that she was safe. I'm going to need to speak to Master Corliss, I told Cormac. And I'm going to need that door properly mended today, not Friday. Will you show me exactly where the wedge is and how the old latch fails, so I can put it to him plainly? Gladly, Cormac said, and there was real relief in his voice, the relief of a man who had been carrying a worry he did not feel it was fully his place to escalate on his own. I've felt sick about this since the moment I heard she'd gone back out to look at it this morning, Sergeant. I should have said myself that 2 days was too long. I know that door better than any man in this household, and I let it sit half-mended because that's how these things are always done here, and I didn't stop to think that half-mended looks exactly like broken to a frightened child. We walked together to the larkspur door, a narrow arched gate set into the old brick wall between the walled garden and the passage that ran back toward the kitchen yard, half hidden behind a stand of espaliered pears that Cormac tended with obvious pride, even in the middle of a conversation like this one. The door itself was unremarkable to look at, old dark wood, iron strap hinges, a plain black painted latch mechanism at hand height that would not have caught my attention at all if I had walked past it on any ordinary day. Cormac showed me the wedge of folded leather tucked into the strike plate, demonstrated the door swinging shut with a firm push, and showed me how, with the wedge in place, the latch's tongue could not fully seat and the door could be pushed open again from either side with moderate pressure. "Try it yourself," he said, and I did, and it worked exactly as he described. a solid but manageable push swinging it open without catching. Then, at his suggestion, I removed the wedge and let the door swing fully shut on its own, unassisted, to see what Maelin herself would have felt the evening before, and I understood within a single attempt exactly what had happened to her. The latch caught hard, a solid metallic clack that had a horrible finality to it, and when I tried the release lever from the inside, the correct one, the one Cormac had shown me, not simply pulling at the door itself. It took a genuinely firm, deliberate push of my own grown man's hand to free it. A frightened 9-year-old, pulling at the door itself the way any child's first instinct would be to do, rather than working the small lever with the particular technique an old gardener's hand had learned over years, would have found it every bit as immovable as she had described to me. I felt something settle in my chest at that, not relief exactly, because it confirmed a genuine mechanical failure rather than any negligence, but a kind of grim clarity, the sense of finally having the whole shape of the thing in front of me rather than pieces of it. "That's it exactly," Cormac said quietly, watching my face. "That's what she felt." I tried it the same way myself this morning, wanting to understand it properly, and it frightened even me a little, knowing a child had been on the other side of that same catch, calling out into an empty garden. I put the wedge back in place myself, tested the door twice more to be certain it held the free-swinging repair Cormac had rigged, and then I went to find Master Corliss, because a stopgap wedge and a promise for Friday was not, in my judgment, a matter that could wait even that long, not with a 9-year-old girl already having gone back out once at first light to test her own fear against it. I found the steward in his small office off the main hall, already at his desk, with the household's morning correspondence spread in front of him, and I will say for Master Corliss, whatever criticism I am about to describe myself making to him, that he received me the moment I appeared in his doorway and set his letters aside without complaint or delay, which is more than can be said for every steward I dealt with in 20 years of service. "Sergeant Voss," he said, rising slightly, "I understand Princess Maelin gave everyone a fright this morning. Is she well?" "She's with her mother, and she's warm, and she's going to be entirely well by the time I'm finished this morning," I told him. "But I need to talk to you about the Larkspur door, Master Corliss, and I want to be direct with you about it, because I don't think anyone in this household did anything wrong last night, and I don't think you did anything wrong either, and I still think a mistake has been made that needs correcting within the hour rather than by Friday." He set his pen down fully then, and gave me his complete attention, which I respected, because a lesser man in his position might have bristled at being told by a guard that a decision within his own domain of household management wanted revisiting. "Go on." I laid it out for him plainly, Cormac's flagged concern from the spring, the fortnight-old escalation, the decision the evening before to schedule the proper repair for the locksmith's ordinary Friday round rather than call him out specially, and Maelin's own return to the door at first light that morning, drawn back to the one piece of evidence that would tell her, in the clearest terms a 9-year-old could understand, whether the thing that had frightened her the night before could genuinely happen again. "I want to be fair to you in saying this," I told him, "because I understand exactly why Friday seemed a reasonable answer last night. The princess was found quickly, she was comforted quickly, the immediate danger, if you can even call it that, given how briefly it lasted, was over within minutes. From where you were standing, informed after the fact that a frightened child had been found safe and settled, a wedge that holds the door open, and a proper repair 2 days off would look like more than sufficient care. I don't fault the reasoning. I fault the outcome, because the reasoning didn't account for what it would look like from a 9-year-old's side of that door the next morning, standing in front of it in her nightgown, trying to work out for herself whether she was actually safe." Master Corliss was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again there was no defensiveness in it at all, only the plain discomfort of a careful man realizing a gap in his own carefulness. "You're entirely right, Sergeant, and I'll not pretend otherwise. I treated it as a maintenance matter once I understood the princess herself was safe and settled, and I judged maintenance matters, even ones touching on a frightening incident, by our ordinary schedule. I did not think to ask myself what that door would mean to her before it was actually replaced. He was already reaching for a small brass bell on the corner of his desk as he spoke. I'll have Mr. Hale sent for directly this morning, whatever it costs to bring him out on a non-scheduled day. And I think, Sergeant, if you have no objection, I ought to be the one to tell His Royal Highness and Her Highness myself, rather than let it reach them as something you had to press me on. It was my decision to make, and my decision to correct. I have thought about that exchange a good number of times in the years since, because I think it says something true about the difference between a household that is careless with its children and a household that simply makes an entirely ordinary, understandable misjudgment in the exhausted aftermath of a frightening evening. Nobody in that chain of decisions, not Cormac, who flagged the latch and then judged, wrongly but not unreasonably, that a wedge would hold until the ordinary round. Not Master Corliss, who accepted that judgment in good faith at the end of a long evening. Not Alara and Rowan, who were never even told the repair had been deferred at all, believing as they had every reason to believe that "we'll have it seen to" meant seen to promptly. None of them set out to leave a broken door standing a moment longer than necessary. They made the kind of small, human, sequential mistake that happens in every household on Earth when tired adults hand a problem down a chain of ordinary procedure at the end of a difficult day. And the only thing that made it matter as much as it did was that the person left waiting on the other side of that procedure was a frightened 9-year-old girl checking the evidence for herself before anyone else was even awake. Mr. Hale, the household locksmith, arrived within the hour, summoned by a message Master Corliss sent with real urgency behind it, and I want to tell you a little about him too, because his part in that morning mattered more than his brief appearance in it might suggest. He was a compact, precise man, the kind who examines a mechanism the way some men examine a puzzle, with obvious pleasure in understanding exactly how a thing has failed before he sets about fixing it. And when Cormac walked him through the Larkspur Latch's history, the fresh paint, the stiffening spring, the fortnight of worsening stickiness, he nodded along with the satisfied recognition of a man hearing a diagnosis confirm his own suspicion. I've seen this exact fault twice this year already, on older housings like this one, he told me, crouched in front of the open latch mechanism with his tools spread on a canvas roll beside him. Paint's a menace to old ironwork if it's not masked properly before the coat goes on, and once it's worked down into a spring housing, there's no cleaning it out again reliably. You're better off replacing the whole mechanism than trying to nurse the old one along. I can have a new latch fitted within the hour, Sergeant, the same modern type we've got on the nursery doors, the kind that releases with a single easy push from the inside. No particular knack required and no risk of it engaging harder than it should regardless of the weather or the paintwork. How long before it's done? I asked him. Give me 40 minutes, he said, already selecting a replacement mechanism from the small case beside him. I keep 2 or 3 of this style on hand for exactly this reason. Half my work in a household this size is old ironwork failing in ways nobody expected. So I've learned to carry what I'm likely to need rather than send back to the workshop for it. I stayed with him while he worked, partly because I wanted to see the repair through with my own eyes before I went back to Maelin, and partly, I will admit, because there was something steadying about watching a careful craftsman put something right in front of me after a morning spent untangling a frightened child's fear from the truth underneath it. Cormac stayed too, offering the occasional observation about the door's particular quirks that only 40 years of tending that garden could have taught him. And by the time the sun had properly cleared the wall and was falling warm across the espaliered pears, Mr. Hale straightened up, wiped his hands, and gave the new latch a demonstration push that swung the door open smooth and easy, with none of the hard metallic clack of the old mechanism. "Try it," he said to me, and I did several times from both sides, and each time it released without the smallest resistance, exactly as he had described. "I'd like the princess to see this herself," I told him. "Would you mind demonstrating it to her directly once I've brought her out? I think it would mean more to her coming from the man who actually fixed it than it will coming from me telling her second-hand that it's been done." Mr. Hale did not hesitate. "Happy to, Sergeant. I've fixed a great many doors and locks in this household over the years, and I'll tell you plainly, this is the first time I've felt glad rather than merely satisfied to finish one. Send for me whenever she's ready." While the repair was underway, I went back to find Alara, because there was a piece of that morning's account I still needed from her and from Rowan directly, rather than second-hand through Susan Locke. Not because I doubted what either of them had told me, but because I wanted, before I brought the whole account to Maelin, to understand exactly what had passed between the three of them the evening before, so that when I finally sat down with her I could confirm, in specific and truthful detail, that her parents had done everything a loving family could possibly have done in the minutes and hours after she was found. I found Rowan and Alara together in a small sitting room near the nursery wing, Rowan still in the previous evening's discarded formality, having clearly not yet gone to bed properly himself, and both of them rose the moment I appeared in the doorway. "How is she?" Rowan asked before I had said a word, and I noted, the way I always noted such things in that household, that it was the very first question, ahead of any question about the door or the staff or what precisely had gone wrong. "Truly, Sergeant," not the polite answer. "She's calmer than she was an hour ago," I told him honestly. "But she's still carrying real fear, Your Royal Highness, and I don't think it will fully lift until she hears the whole of what happened laid out clearly, with the actual door standing open and easy behind it. I've spent the last hour establishing exactly that. I'd like to walk you both through it, and then, with your permission, bring Maelin in and do the same for her." "Please," Alara said, "everything. I want to know all of it." I gave them the full account, much as I have given it to you. The timeline reconstructed from 4 independent sources, the 19 minutes, Cormac's swift discovery, the household's genuinely fast response, and then the part that I suspected would trouble them more than anything else, because it touched their own actions rather than a stranger's mechanical failure. The deferred repair, the wedge, and Maelin's return to the door at first light to test, on her own, whether she had been told the truth the night before. Rowan was quiet for a long moment after I finished, and when he spoke his voice had an edge to it I had not heard from him before, though it was not directed at me, or even really at Master Corliss. "We told her it was being fixed," he said. "Last night, sitting on her bed, both of us told her it would be put right and she'd never have to worry about that door again. I meant it when I said it. I had no idea it meant Friday." "I don't believe you were told it meant Friday, Your Royal Highness," I said. "I believe you were told, in good faith, that it would be seen to, and that everyone involved in that conversation believed that meant promptly, and that the gap between seen to and seen to today was never actually spoken aloud by anyone until I asked the question directly this morning. I don't think that's a failure of anyone's love for her. I think it's the kind of gap that opens up in any household, however careful, when a frightening evening ends in relief, and everyone involved is exhausted and glad the child is safe, and the specific hour of a repair gets left unspoken because nobody thinks, in that moment, that the hour matters as much as the fact of the repair happening at all." "It mattered to her," Alara said quietly. "It mattered enough that she went back out there alone at dawn rather than trust that it had been handled." "It did," I agreed, because there was no honest way to soften that particular truth, and I did not think either of them would have wanted me to. Which is exactly why I think the most important thing that happens this morning isn't only that the latch gets replaced, though it has been, and quickly, once I raised it with Master Corliss. It's that Maelin sees it happen, not hears about it happening, sees it with her own eyes, the door swinging open easy under her own hand, so that the fear has somewhere solid to land instead of somewhere to keep circling. Ilara was already rising. Then let's go to her now. We found Maelin still in the guardroom by the kitchens, dressed by then in a warm daytime gown and proper slippers, sitting close beside Susan Locke with a mostly finished cup of warm milk in front of her, and Torin, her older brother, perched on the bench beside her with the particular solemn attentiveness of an 11-year-old, trying very hard to be useful in a situation he did not fully understand. He had heard, I gathered, second-hand from the household's fast-moving morning gossip, that his sister had been found crying on the lawn, and had come to sit with her without being asked, which I mention because it was exactly the kind of small, unremarkable kindness that told you more about that household than any formal account could. Emeric found her, Torin was explaining to Susan, with the confident air of a boy relaying facts he had assembled himself from half a dozen overheard fragments. And she's not hurt, and the door's getting fixed properly this time, not just the leather thing. And he broke off when he saw his mother and father in the doorway and straightened slightly, and Maelin's head came up too, her eyes finding mine first, searching my face for whatever news I was bringing back. I crouched down in front of her again, the same way I had on the lawn, so that we were level with each other, and I let Ilara and Rowan settle on either side of her rather than standing over her, because I wanted this conversation to feel like something happening with her rather than something being delivered to her. I told you I'd find out exactly what happened, I said, and I have, every piece of it. Would you like me to tell you all of it in order, the way it actually happened? She nodded, small and serious, both hands wrapped around her cup. You went out to the garden after supper to play with Juniper, I began. That was a little after 7:15. You chased him through the larkspur door, and it swung shut behind you, and the latch caught in a way it wasn't supposed to catch, because of a fault in the mechanism that had nothing to do with anything you did. You tried to open it and it wouldn't move, and you called out, and it felt like nobody was coming, and that was frightening. I'm not going to tell you it wasn't frightening, Maelin, because I don't think that would be honest, and I don't think you'd believe me if I said it. It felt like forever, she said very quietly. I believe you completely that it felt that way, I told her. I want you to hear me say that clearly, because I'm not telling you what I'm about to tell you in order to say your fear wasn't real. It was entirely real, but I've spent this whole morning finding out exactly how long it actually was, from 4 different people who each kept their own separate record of the evening without knowing what the others had written down, and every single one of them agrees, almost to the minute. Would you like to know the number? She nodded again, and I could see Rowan's hand come to rest gently on her shoulder beside me. 19 minutes, I told her. From the moment the door caught behind you to the moment Cormac had you up in his arms and was carrying you back toward the house. I know that seems impossible to you, because I promise you, it seemed nearly impossible to me too, hearing you describe it this morning as though it had lasted the whole night. But it's true, and I can show you exactly how I know it's true if you'd like. How? She asked, and there was the first small thread of genuine curiosity in her voice, cutting through the fear, which is a thing I have always watched for in a frightened child, because curiosity is very often the first sign that the fear has stopped growing and started, however slowly, to shrink. I told her about Cormac's little notebook, and the times he wrote down for his own watering rounds without anyone asking him to. I told her about the porter's log at the kitchen yard gate, which had recorded, in an entirely different handwriting, the exact minute Cormac had carried her through it. I told her about the kitchen's own supper record, showing when her plate had been cleared that evening, which let me work out, independently of everything else, roughly when she must have gone out to play. And I told her that all 3 records, kept by 3 different people for 3 entirely different reasons, none of them thinking about her fear at all when they wrote them down, agreed with each other almost exactly. "That's how I know it's true," I said. "Not because I'm telling you to feel better, but because 3 separate people who weren't even thinking about you when they wrote those numbers down all happened to write down the same short amount of time. 19 minutes doesn't feel like 19 minutes when you're scared," she said, with the sudden plain wisdom children sometimes produce out of nowhere, and Alara made a small sound beside her that was half a laugh and half something closer to tears. "No," I agreed. "It doesn't, and I don't think there's anything wrong with you for it not feeling that way. I think that's simply what fear does to time, and it happens to grown men too, Maelin, not only to children. I've stood through moments in my own service that felt like they lasted an hour and turned out, when I checked afterward, to have lasted less than a minute. It isn't a flaw in you. It's only how fear works in everyone, and the reason it matters to find out the true number afterward isn't to prove your feelings wrong. It's so that the frightened part of you has something solid to stand on once the fear itself has passed. Would you like to try something with me, to see what 19 minutes actually feels like, now that you're safe and there's nothing to be afraid of?" She looked uncertain but nodded, and I asked Susan Locke, who was watching this whole exchange with visible relief, whether there was a clock in the room, and there was, a plain mantel clock above the kitchen hearth with a steady, audible tick. "We're not going to sit here for the whole 19 minutes, I told Maelin, smiling, because I did not think either of us needed to sit through a full 19 minutes to make the point. "But let's watch it for 1 minute together, just one, and really pay attention to how long a single minute actually is when nothing frightening is happening. Can you tell me when you think a minute has passed, before I show you the clock?" It is a small exercise, one I had used before with other frightened children in that household over the years, and it worked the way it generally does. Maelin watched the fire and fidgeted and glanced at me twice, and finally said with real uncertainty, "Now, is it now?" At somewhere around 40 seconds, well short of the actual minute, and when I showed her the clock and she saw how much time remained, her whole face changed with the particular startled recognition of a child discovering something true about the world that no one had ever quite explained to her before. "See," I said, "even sitting here safe, with your mother and father right beside you, a minute felt shorter to you than it actually was, once you started paying close attention to it. Now imagine 19 of those minutes, alone, frightened, in a garden going dim, with a door that won't open. Of course it felt like forever, Maelin. Of course it did. That doesn't mean you were wrong to feel that way. It only means that fear and clocks don't measure things the same way, and it's the guard's job, my job, to bring the clock's answer back to you once the fear has had its say, so you can hold both things at once. It was genuinely frightening, and it was genuinely short. Both are true." She was quiet for a moment, turning that over with the particular seriousness 9-year-olds bring to ideas that are just slightly too big for them, reaching for the shape of it anyway. "Everyone came so fast, though," she said slowly, as though working it out loud for the first time. "Cormac came really fast, and Mama and Papa came really fast after that. I remember that part now. I was cold and scared, but I wasn't alone for very long at all, was I?" "No," Alara said, her voice thick, pulling her daughter in against her side. "You weren't, sweetheart. I have never in my life moved as fast through this palace as I moved the moment Susan's message reached me. I was holding you within minutes. I know it didn't feel that way from where you were sitting, and I understand now, hearing everything the sergeant has found out this morning, exactly why it didn't. But I promise you, on everything I hold dear, that not one single moment passed last night where I wasn't either coming to you or already with you, from the second I knew you needed me." "I know," Maelin said in a small voice. "I think I knew that already, really. I just this morning when I saw the door was still broken, It felt like it was happening again, and then I couldn't remember which parts were real and which parts were the scared parts. "That happens to grown-ups too," Rowan said gently, and I was glad he said it, because it mattered more coming from her father than it would have coming from me. "More than you'd think. Fear muddles things up, and it takes someone patient, checking every piece of it properly, to help sort out which parts actually happened and which parts only felt like they did. That's exactly what the sergeant has spent this whole morning doing for you, and I want you to understand something else too, before we go any further. The door not being properly mended yet this morning wasn't your fault, and it wasn't anyone trying to be careless with you. It was a mistake in how quickly a repair got scheduled, and it is a mistake your mother and I are both genuinely sorry happened, even though it happened for entirely ordinary, understandable reasons, and not because anyone stopped caring about you for even a single moment." I watched Maelin take that in, watched something in her small shoulders come down from where they had been held tight since I first found her on the lawn, and I judged, from long practice reading exactly this kind of moment in exactly this kind of child, that it was time for the last piece of what I had come to give her. "There's one more thing," I told her. "Mr. Hale, our locksmith, has already fitted a brand new latch on the Larkspur door this morning. Not a leather wedge holding the old one open, an entirely new mechanism, the same easy kind you've got on your own nursery door, that opens with one simple push and never catches the way the old one did. I'd like to take you out to see it for yourself, and try it with your own hand if you're ready. I think it will mean more than anything I can tell you." She looked up at her mother, then at her father, and then last at me, and I saw the particular resolve settle over her face that I had come to recognize in 11 years around that household, as entirely her own, not her mother's caution nor her father's steadiness, but something that belonged to Maelin alone, a determination to see a frightening thing through to the end rather than simply be told it was finished. "Yes," she said. "I want to see it." The walk out to the walled garden that morning is one I have thought back on more than almost any other stretch of ground I ever crossed in my years at Harrowgate, not because anything dramatic happened along it, but because of the particular quality of the small procession we made Maelin between her mother and father, holding a hand on each side, Torrin trailing a half-step behind with Bram, who had by then been fetched from his own breakfast, and told only that his sister needed him to come and see something, trotting to keep pace beside him, and myself a pace ahead, the way I always walked when I was leading a household somewhere rather than simply escorting one person. Susan Locke came too, and word must have traveled faster through that palace than I gave it credit for, because by the time we reached the garden gate, Cormac was already waiting there with Mr. Hale, and even Master Corliss had come down from his office, standing a little apart with the particular formal stillness of a man who had made a mistake that morning, and intended to see its correction through in person, rather than delegate the witnessing of it to anyone else. Juniper the cat was there too, perched with supreme indifference on the top of the garden wall in a patch of early sun, and Maelin's face did something complicated and lovely when she saw him, half a laugh breaking through everything else that morning had put her through. "There you are," she told the cat, with real reproach in her voice. "This is all your fault, you know," and Bram, not quite 6 and taking his cue as always from whatever emotional temperature his older siblings set, dissolved into giggles at that, which did more to loosen the last of the tension in the little group gathered by the gate than anything any of the adults had managed to say. Mr. Hale stepped forward when we reached the door itself, and I was glad, watching him do it, that I had asked him to be the one to demonstrate the repair directly to her, because there is a particular authority a craftsman carries when he explains his own work to a child, an authority no amount of reassurance from a parent or a guard can quite substitute for. "Your Royal Highness," he said to Maelin, with a small formal bow that made her almost smile despite everything, "I understand you had some trouble with this door last night." "It wouldn't open," she said. "I pulled and pulled." "You did exactly the right thing trying to pull it," Mr. Hale told her, crouching down to bring himself to something closer to her height, the way I had done on the lawn an hour before, and I noted it and was glad of it. "The trouble wasn't with how you tried to open it. The trouble was that the old latch in there had gone stiff with a bit of paint that worked down into its spring, so that it caught harder than it was ever supposed to, and needed a particular firm push on a lever most grown-ups wouldn't even have known to look for, let alone a child. That's not a fault in you at all. That's a fault in the door, and I want you to understand that clearly, because I've replaced the whole mechanism this morning with a new one that doesn't have that fault. Would you like to see how it works now?" She nodded, and he showed her, opening and closing the door several times himself first, letting her watch the new latch catch with a soft, easy click quite unlike the hard metallic clack the old one had made, and then he stepped back and gestured her forward. "Go on," he said. "Push it shut yourself all the way and then try opening it from this side. I want you to feel it for yourself, not just watch me do it." Maelin looked back once at her mother, who nodded, and then stepped up to the door, and I watched her push it shut, a proper firm push. The door swinging closed with the same soft click Mr. Hale's demonstration had made, nothing like the hard catch of the night before, and then, without any hesitation at all, reach for the handle and push it open again, easily, on the very first try. She did it again, and then a third time faster, testing it, the particular thorough skepticism of a child who has been frightened by a mechanism and will not simply take an adult's word that it has been fixed, wants to feel the proof of it under her own hand, over and over, until the proof outweighs the memory. I have watched a great many people test their own safety after a fright, in one form or another, across 20 years of service, and I have never seen anyone go about it more sensibly than Maelin did that morning, pushing that door open 6 or 7 times in a row with steadily loosening shoulders, until finally she stepped back, looked up at Mr. Hale, and said, with the particular gravity of a 9-year-old delivering a verdict, "It's really fixed." "It's really fixed," Mr. Hale agreed. "And I'll tell you something else, Your Royal Highness, so you know it isn't only this one door you need never worry about again. Sergeant Voss asked me this morning to look over every latch of this same old style anywhere in the grounds you and your brothers have access to. And I mean to do exactly that before the week is out, so that whatever happened here last night can't happen again anywhere else in this garden either." I had, in fact, asked him exactly that, in the few minutes we'd had alone while he finished the repair, because it had occurred to me, turning the whole morning over in my mind while I watched him work, that a single fixed door was not quite the same thing as a genuinely reassured child, and that the most honest gift I could give Maelin that morning was not simply the truth about the previous evening but real, verifiable confidence about every evening still to come. Master Corliss, overhearing this exchange from where he stood a little apart, stepped forward then, and I watched him do something I respected a great deal, which was to address Maelin directly rather than simply speaking about her to the adults around her. "Princess Maelin," he said, with a small formal bow of his own, "I want to tell you myself that the delay in mending this door properly was my mistake, and mine alone. Mr. Hollis flagged it to me as needing attention, and I judged wrongly that a temporary repair would hold safely enough until our locksmith's ordinary schedule brought him round to it. I did not think, when I made that judgment last night, about what it would mean for you to wake this morning uncertain whether you were truly safe. I am sorry for that, and I want you to know that from this day forward, any matter touching a child's safety in this household, however small it may seem, will be treated as needing attention that same day, not the next convenient one." Maelin regarded him with the particular solemn formality children sometimes summon for exactly this kind of moment, and then, unexpectedly, stepped forward and hugged him, briefly, around the middle, the way she might have hugged any familiar adult in that household she trusted, and I watched a man who had spent the morning composing a careful, dignified apology go rather visibly to pieces for a second or two before he recovered himself enough to pat her shoulder and say, in a voice not entirely steady, that he was very glad she was safe. Cormac, for his part, had been standing a little back through all of this, and it was Maelin herself who noticed him and went to him next, tugging at his sleeve until he crouched down properly to her level. "You found me," she said simply, as though this were the single most important fact of the whole morning, which, I have come to believe over the years of telling this story, it very nearly was. "I did," Cormac said, "and I'll tell you something, Princess, since we're all being honest this morning. I've tended that garden the better part of 40 years, and I know every sound it makes, the wind in the pears and the glasshouse vents rattling and old juniper yowling at nothing at all. And I knew the moment I heard you, calling from behind that door, that it wasn't any of the garden's ordinary sounds. It was you, and I came as fast as these old legs would carry me, and I'll come exactly as fast every single time, for as long as I'm the one tending this garden, whether it's you or your brothers or any child who ever plays in it after you've all grown too big for hide-and-seek among the cold frames." She hugged him too, and Juniper, apparently deciding the moment called for his participation, leapt down from the wall and wound himself around both their ankles, which broke whatever solemnity remained in the little gathering and set Bram off giggling again. And even Rowan laughed, a real laugh, the first I had heard from him that morning, and I felt something in my own chest ease that I had not fully realized was still held tight until that exact moment. Before the little gathering broke up, I did something I had not planned to do when I first set out that morning to establish the facts of what had happened, but which felt, once the moment arrived, like the only proper way to finish the work I had started. I asked Master Corliss whether the household kept any formal record of incidents involving the children, not gossip, not the kind of account that travels corridor to corridor and grows or shrinks in the telling, but a written record, dated and precise, that could be consulted afterward by anyone who needed the plain truth of a thing, rather than whatever version had settled into memory. He told me there was such a record, kept in the household office chiefly for matters of health and safety, and that he would see an entry made for that morning's events himself, in his own hand, that same day. "I'd like to write it myself, if you'll permit it," I told him, "and I'd like Cormac and Susan and Mr. Hale each to read it over and correct anything I've gotten wrong before it's entered, so that what goes into that book isn't only my account of what everyone told me, but something each of them has actually confirmed as accurate." Master Corliss agreed readily enough, and I spent a good part of that afternoon, once the immediate business of the morning had settled, sitting at a corner of his office with a clean sheet of paper, setting down the whole timeline as plainly and exactly as I could manage. The supper logs 22 minutes past 6, Maelin's departure for the garden a little after 7:15. Cormac's watering round beginning at 7:15 and his discovery of her a minute or two past the half hour, the porter's record of 17 minutes to 8, the mechanical fault in the latch and its cause, the wedge, the deferred repair, and finally its correction that same morning. I wrote it, I will admit, with more care than I generally gave to the routine entries such a book usually held, because I understood, by the time I sat down to it, that I was not only recording an incident for the household's own future reference. I was building, piece by verified piece, the very account I intended to be able to hand to Maelin herself one day, years from then, if she ever wanted it, not a story softened for a child's comfort, but the plain, checked truth, written down close enough to the event that no later uncertainty could creep in and blur it. Cormac read it over first, correcting the precise minute of his watering round start, which he remembered slightly differently on paper than he had told me aloud that morning, and Susan corrected a detail about which window she had watched Maelin from. Mr. Hale added, in his own neat hand beneath my account, a brief technical note about the fault in the old latch and the specification of the replacement, in case any similar mechanism elsewhere in the grounds should ever show the same signs of stiffening. By the time the entry was complete and signed by all four of us, it read less like an alarming incident report and more like exactly what it was: a small, honestly documented mechanical failure, quickly discovered, promptly resolved, and thoroughly corrected, with nothing in it that any member of that household needed to hide from or feel ashamed of, only a plain record of what had gone wrong and precisely how it had been put right. I brought that finished page to Rowan and Alara myself that evening, before I went off duty, and sat with them while they read it through together, Alara's hand resting on the page as though she wanted to feel the solidity of the written account as much as read it. 19 minutes, Rowan said again, quietly, when he reached the bottom of the page, the same number he had already heard from me that morning, but which seemed to settle differently now that it stood written and signed rather than simply spoken. I keep turning that over. It felt, hearing her this morning, like it must have been so much more. That's exactly what fear does, I said. I don't think there's a parent alive who wouldn't have felt those same 19 minutes stretch out, just as long as Maelin did, hearing about them secondhand and imagining every possible version of what might have happened in them. I think that's precisely why it mattered to check it as carefully as I did, Your Royal Highness, not because I doubted your household's care for her, but because a number checked 4 independent ways carries a kind of solidity that even the most loving reassurance on its own sometimes can't quite match, for a frightened child or for a worried parent, either one. Thank you, Alara said, and there was something in the way she said it that told me she meant it for more than simply the morning's work. Not only for finding her, or for finding the truth of it. For understanding that she needed both, the comfort and the proof, and for not treating either one as though it could stand in for the other. I did not know, sitting in that small sitting room with the finished page between us, quite how to answer that, so I said only that it was the whole of what the post required of me, which was true, though I have come to understand, telling this story so many times since, that it was perhaps not the whole truth of why I had spent the morning the way I had. Some part of it, I think, was simply that I had once been a frightened child myself, a very long time before that particular morning, in circumstances of my own that have no place in this account, and I had learned early, the hard way, how much it matters to a child whether the adults around her treat her fear as something to be managed quickly and set aside, or something worth the trouble of understanding properly, all the way down to its true and precise shape. I did not choose the household posting all those years before by accident, whatever I may have told Sergeant Major Pell about instinct at the time. Some part of me, I believe now, chose it because I wanted, in some small way I could not have explained then, to be the kind of guard I had once badly needed and had not always had. We did not linger in the garden a great deal longer after the demonstration itself. Alara took Maelin's hand and walked her once more through the newly mended gate, in and out, 3 or 4 more times, unhurried, letting her set her own pace with it, while the rest of us stood back and let mother and daughter have that particular quiet ritual to themselves. I remember watching them and thinking that this, more than the notebook timings or the porter's log or even Mr. Hale's careful demonstration, was probably the piece of that morning that would matter most in the weeks to come. Not the facts alone, though the facts mattered enormously, but a mother walking her daughter through the thing that had frightened her, over and over patiently, until it had been worn back down into an ordinary garden gate rather than the mouth of some remembered terror. King Alaric himself, I should say, was informed of the whole matter later that same morning, once Rowan judged there was a complete and settled account to bring him rather than a half-finished worry, and I was told afterward, second-hand, through the sort of channel such things always travel in a household of that size, that his only real question, once he had heard the full timeline and the repair confirmed, was whether Cormac and Mr. Hale had been properly thanked for how quickly they had each responded. Which struck me, when I heard it, as exactly the right question for a grandfather to ask once the frightening part of a story was safely behind everyone involved. I want to tell you now about the days that followed, because I think they matter to the honesty of this account every bit as much as the morning itself did. Maelin did not, as sometimes happens with children after a fright, avoid that garden. If anything, she was drawn back to it more than usual over the following week, and I watched her, on more than one occasion when my own duties brought me near enough to see, walk deliberately to the larkspur door, push it open, step through, and push it shut again behind her over and over, a small private ritual that had nothing to do with play and everything to do with a 9-year-old girl quietly, methodically, rebuilding her own trust in a door with her own 2 hands, at her own pace. Until one afternoon, perhaps 10 days after that first morning, I saw her chase Juniper straight through it without a second glance, the whole business apparently forgotten in the ordinary, unremarkable way that childhood fears eventually resolve themselves once the facts underneath them have been properly settled, and the world has demonstrated, patiently and repeatedly, that it can be trusted again. She sought me out once more during that week, a few days after the morning I have been describing, finding me at my post near the east portico in the middle of an entirely ordinary afternoon, and I want to set down what she said to me then, because I think it is, in its own small way, the truest thing anyone said to me in the whole of that story. I told everyone it was all night, she said, without preamble, in the direct way children sometimes arrive at things adults spend paragraphs working up to. Even though it wasn't. I knew it wasn't really, once I thought about it properly. I just didn't know how to explain how it felt without saying it that way. I crouched down to her, the way I always did, and considered my answer carefully because I thought it mattered. I don't think you did anything wrong telling it that way, I said. You told me exactly how it felt, as honestly as you knew how to tell it, and that's not the same thing as lying, even when the actual clock disagrees with it. My job that morning wasn't to prove you'd exaggerated. It was to find out what was true underneath how frightened you were, so that both things, how it felt, and what actually happened, could sit together properly, without either one having to be wrong for the other to be right. She considered that with her usual seriousness, and then said, I'm not scared of that door anymore. I know, I told her. I've seen you going through it. Cormac says he's going to teach me how the new latch works from the inside properly, in case it's ever dark and I can't see it, so I never have to wonder again. That sounds like Cormac, I said, and meant it, and she smiled, a real smile, unshadowed by anything of the fear I had carried her in from the lawn a week before, and ran off toward the garden, and I watched her go with the particular quiet satisfaction that I have come, across 20 years of service, to understand is the truest reward this work ever offers, not the dramatic rescues, though I had my share of those over the years, but the small, unremarkable mornings afterward, when a frightened child runs off into an ordinary afternoon, entirely unafraid. Because someone took the time to find out, carefully and completely, exactly what was true. I have told this story many times since, to young guardsmen new to household duty who sometimes arrive expecting their work to be made of dramatic confrontations and daring rescues, and I tell it to them precisely, because it was neither of those things, not really. Nobody locked Princess Maelin out all night. Nobody in that household, from the gardener up through the king himself, ever once treated her safety as anything less than the most serious matter in front of them. What actually happened to her was small and mechanical and entirely accidental. A spring latch stiffened by a bead of paint, a 9-year-old's grip not quite equal to a firm push most grown hands would have managed without thinking, 19 minutes of real fear in a garden going dim, and a rescue that came, by any fair measure, about as quickly as any rescue reasonably could. The only genuine mistake in the whole of it was a single day's delay in an ordinary repair schedule, made in good faith by tired people at the end of a difficult evening, and even that mistake was found, owned, and corrected within a single morning, by a household that cared enough about one small girl's peace of mind to treat a leather wedge and a Friday appointment as entirely unacceptable the moment someone thought to look at it through her eyes, instead of through the ordinary business of household maintenance. What lingered, and what I think is worth saying plainly at the end of this account, was never the danger. It was the gap between what had actually happened and what it had felt like happening, and the particular patient work of closing that gap for a child too young yet to do it fully for herself. I do not think Maelin's fear that first morning was ever really about the 19 minutes themselves, frightening as they were while she lived through them. I think it was about the uncertainty that followed, the not quite knowing, in the muddled, half-remembered aftermath of real fear, whether the worst of it was truly over, or whether it might simply be waiting, quietly, behind an ordinary garden door, to happen again. A guard's job, I came to understand more clearly that week than I had in 11 years before it, is not only to answer danger when it is actually present. It is, just as often, to sit with a frightened child long enough, and check every fact carefully enough, that the danger she believes is still waiting for her can be shown, gently and completely, not to be there at all. Princess Maelin grew, in the years that followed, into precisely the kind of person you might expect from a child who once tested a mended garden gate 7 times in a row before she would trust it, thorough. A little stubborn about wanting to see proof of things for herself, rather than simply take them on faith. And if I may say so without overstepping, entirely unafraid of gardens or doors or dusk, for the whole rest of the childhood I had the privilege of watching over. Cormac kept his promise and taught her the new Latch's inside mechanism by feel as well as by sight, so that she could work it blind if she ever needed to. And I am told she in turn taught the same trick, years later, to her younger cousins, passing along a small piece of practical confidence that had once cost a very frightened 9-year-old a barefoot run across a wet lawn to acquire. There was one more piece to that story, which did not properly finish itself until nearly a month later, and I think it belongs here, at the end of this account, because it is the part that turned one frightened morning into something more lasting than a single mended door. I raised it first with Master Corliss, in the days right after the Larkspur repair, and then, once he had taken it further up the household's chain of authority than I had any standing to carry it myself, it reached Crown Prince Rowan directly, and from him, in due course, the king. What I proposed was simple enough, though it had not occurred to anyone, myself included, until the morning I have just described made the gap in our own thinking plain. I asked that every latch, lock, and gate mechanism anywhere on the grounds that a child of the household might reasonably encounter unsupervised, every garden door, every old cupboard with a catch that stuck, every gate along the paths the children were free to wander in fine weather, be inspected once, thoroughly, not on the ordinary maintenance schedule but as a single dedicated survey. With any mechanism found to require an old hand's particular knack for opening, flagged for immediate replacement, rather than deferred to the next convenient round. Mr. Hale undertook the survey himself over the better part of a fortnight, with Cormac walking every inch of the grounds beside him, the two of them working through the old estate with the patient, unglamorous thoroughness of men who had both, in their own ways, felt the weight of that single morning, and did not intend to let a second one happen anywhere else in that household on their watch. They found 4 more mechanisms worth replacing before they were through, none of them, I want to be clear, anywhere near as likely to trap a child as the Larkspur latch had been, and none of them associated with any incident at all, before or since. A stiff catch on the old potting shed door that Torrin and his friends sometimes used as a hideout. A gate along the kitchen garden wall with a similar spring mechanism to the one that had failed Maelin, though this one had not yet begun to stick. A cupboard latch in the old schoolroom that Bram, still small enough to squeeze into places his older siblings could not, had once gotten his fingers pinched in without anyone thinking much of it at the time. and a side door off the stable yard that nobody had used regularly in years, but which the children sometimes wandered past on their way to visit the ponies. Each one was replaced with the same modern, easy-release mechanism Mr. Hale had fitted on the Larkspur gate, and each replacement was entered, in the same careful hand I had used for the first, into the household safety record, so that the whole survey stood afterward as a complete, verifiable account of what had been checked, what had been found, and what had been corrected. I mention all of this not because I want to claim any particular credit for it. The idea was a simple one, and I have no doubt some other guard, some other morning, would have arrived at the same thought eventually, given the same frightened child and the same string of small mechanical failures to untangle. I mention it because I think it is the truest measure of how that household actually responded to what had happened to Maelin, once the full truth of it was laid plainly in front of them. A household that wished only to smooth over an uncomfortable morning would have mended the one door that had failed and considered the matter closed. This one spent a fortnight walking every gate and latch on the grounds, at real expense and real inconvenience, because a 9-year-old girl had once stood barefoot on a wet lawn certain, for however brief and mistaken a time, that no one was coming for her, and everyone who heard the full account of that morning decided, independently and without needing to be asked twice, that such a thing was worth guarding against everywhere, not only in the one place it had actually happened. King Alaric, I was told, asked to see the finished survey himself once it was complete, and read through the whole of it in his own study one evening, and the only alteration he requested, when Rowan brought it to him, was that a standing instruction be added to the household's permanent procedures. That any matter touching a child's safety, however minor it might first appear, be treated thereafter as requiring same-day resolution as a matter of course, never deferred to an ordinary schedule regardless of how small or how quickly resolved the original incident had seemed. Master Corliss himself drafted that instruction in the end, and I have always thought there was a particular fittingness in that. The same steward whose single misjudgment had left a door half-mended overnight becoming the one who wrote the rule that would keep any household after him from making the same understandable human mistake twice. As for me, I never did stop checking that particular door on my rounds, long after Mr. Hale's new latch had proven itself sound 100 times over, not because I doubted the repair, but because I had learned something that morning about the value of simply looking, carefully and without assuming, at the small ordinary things a household leaves half-finished in the relief of a crisis passing. It cost me nothing but a few extra seconds on my rounds, and it meant that I could tell any child who ever asked me, with complete honesty, that I had checked it myself, that very morning and every morning after. That, in the end, is most of what this work ever really asks of a man standing post in a household full of children, not grand gestures, but the quiet discipline of checking and checking again, until the truth is solid enough for a frightened child to stand on it without flinching.